Welcome to the Culturevating Leader podcast, a podcast for founders and people leaders who know that culture isn't written in policy. It's felt in every emotion your team experiences at work. I'm Sarah Denner, co-founder of The Culturevators and managing director of New Wave Learning. And in each episode of this podcast, I explore what it really means to be a cultivating leader. You'll hear stories, insights, and practical moves for turning emotion into a strategic lever for performance, loyalty, and growth. I'm excited. So let's get into it. So, Joe, I'm delighted to have you with me and our listeners today, recording our episode of the Cultivating Leader podcast. To get us started, we connected and share a real passion for inclusive culture and inclusive leadership. So I'd love to get started in our conversation, just acknowledging how you personally have built your career around helping leaders and organisations to take inclusion seriously. And I'd love to know, when you walk into a workplace, what are the signs and signals, the conversations and behaviours that tell you whether the culture is inclusive or not?
Well, firstly, thanks, Sarah, for having this conversation. I love talking about inclusive cultures and inclusive leadership. So it's an absolute pleasure to be talking about it again today. I think that's a great question. When I've reflected on it, I think it was one thing that came to mind for me straight away was it wasn't a one-off event. It would be the kind of regular team meetings where you'd really get a sense of a team in action and the culture within a team or the culture within a company or a firm. You can sometimes get a sense of that when you walk into an open desk, a hot desking area. If there's a team sitting there, often nowadays that's not the case. You can get a little sense of it, but in a meeting itself, I've often found that you can tell if people are speaking up, if people are talking in terms of only positive stuff, or whether they're mentioning mistakes or learnings or failures. The attention people are taking in terms of listening and responding to questions and asking other colleagues questions about whatever they've spoken about. Interruptions and general kind of welcoming nature to people being into the meeting that perhaps aren't usually there. I think so much can be told from the rather mundane weekly conversations and, fortnightly team catch-ups. They don't have to be big and fancy and, putting on a whole team meeting. And I think those ones, say a lot. The behaviours that you see in those, who's being quieter than, is that normal? Why they being quieter than others? Why are some speaking or allowing space? Are they allowing people to speak up? Is there psychological safety there? What's the dynamic between people of different levels of seniority and people virtually versus in person? So I think for me, a kind of regular team meeting is a real great place to work out a team culture or culture of business.
Yeah, I love that response. Thank you, because your response has made me reflect on actually some assumption and bias that came from my question, which I wasn't expecting, because actually you pulled out, there were two things that you said there that made that moment for me happen, which was it, first of all, not being a one-off event. So you don't, you can't almost, it's difficult to say whether a place is inclusive or not in a one-off event. And I couldn't agree more. But the other thing that made me think about it was the absence of people in the building. So my question came from a place of curiosity particularly around the fact that the recruitment market right now is so difficult. And, individual confidence levels, I believe, if you're out of work at the moment, individual confidence levels have to be at their all time low. Like, I can't imagine a time where in recruitment, confidence as an individual can ever have been this low. And please, if you think of another time, please tell me, because I'm really curious about this topic. So my question came from the perspective of, when you go for an interview, one of the
Mm.
things that you are kind of encouraged or trained to look for is this a good culture for me? Is this a culture fit? The interviewer is doing it of you, and you are in turn doing it of them and the organization. So if it's not if looking for an inclusive culture is not a one-off event, and there is now an absence of people in the building and you might not even be going into the building yourself. Like, I've made an assumption in my question that you are physically in the workplace. You might have walked into a Zoom room or equivalent, right? And that really made me reflect then on the debate around how can we ever assess for cultural fit on both sides of the conversation in an inclusive way? Like, how are we expecting to do that? And it's a rhetorical
It is,
question. If you have an
yes.
answer, I'd love to hear it. But that was what was behind my question.
And I think it's hugely difficult, especially when you're dialing in to something. And if there is a mix of people online and in person, that's always a difficult dynamic.
Yeah.
But even I found reading job descriptions and how people describe their role or describe the business can be a giveaway. But what in essence is, I found that, yes, a lot of people can talk as well and can put on a different demeanor and give a sense. And if you're being interviewed by somebody, it can often be their own personal style that comes across necessarily rather than the team style. So it's always good historically, I've enjoyed meeting other people within the team at different levels. And I think that's hugely important. So you can begin to build a wider sense of that team and what it's like to be a team member, senior and more junior as well. But yeah, I think sometimes you don't know until you're in there.
Until you're in it.
And that
Yeah.
makes it incredibly hard, both sides, both sides.
Yeah. Well, and I think, some of the insights you shared around the importance of paying attention and noticing then really come to the forefront as a skill, don't they? Because you have to look for, and I loved your tip, by the way, about, even reading the job description can be a clue or a giveaway about what the culture of an organization is going to be like. I hadn't thought about that one. So brilliant top tip already. But I guess that being able to, especially in recruitment, when you are, again, we're programmed to sort of come in with the attitude that they are watching me and I need to perform. You're then less likely to be attentive because you're focusing on your performance to
Yes.
hopefully get the
Yeah.
job of your dreams
Absolutely.
in your ideal company, etc., etc. You then disconnect from the skill of noticing those small things. So being then intentional about, well, what else do I need from my hiring process, for example, to be able to build out a broader picture is really important.
Massively. And I don't think it's necessarily set up well.
Yes.
Because the only time you get to is that, any questions for us, usually at the end of an interview. And most people are like, oh goodness me, what can I ask? And it's very hard to, what question do you ask? What's a good question to ask to try and ascertain what's being said or not said, you
Yes.
know?
Well, especially when the outcome of your interview is, the salary to pay your mortgage or whatever, it's hard, right? To be that, possibly to be that confident when you haven't established whether this is an inclusive and safe place for you to honestly answer the questions that are important to you.
Yes.
So it's a real dance, isn't it? It's a real dance, and I think there's a lot to explore in there. But what I guess we've sort of started this conversation looking at the organisational culture. This podcast is called The Culturevating Leader, and you and I both agree heavily that leadership sets the tone for the culture, either be it a good one or a less good one. So I'd like to develop that idea by asking you to define for you, with the lens of inclusive leadership kind of on, what does being a cultivating leader mean to you, and how does that show up in your leadership intentions, both today and perhaps for the future?
And I think it's a couple of ways that I look at it and how it affects me today. I think one of the things is about considering how we connect and we make those connections. More importantly, how do we connect and then collaborate with whoever you need to make connections with? And how do we do that in a way that your project team, your organization can thrive, rather than just be full of people who are there because it's their job and they need to earn money? So how can you really create that team and collaboration of working together with the best that everyone can bring and their strengths to a place that they can thrive? And for me, at the moment, how that kind of shows up is about that. What's important within that, maybe not yet how it shows up, is about psychological safety.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one big thing for me. And intention, it's a bit too easy to say assuming positive intention, but I think those are absolutely, for me, key minimums in order to create this. Any team or project team or group of people together that can thrive requires that absolute basis of psychological safety and an understanding and appreciation of intention behind things. Without that, I think it's too easy to form negative habits or negative feelings or negative consequences from anything, small or big. And I have actually a card in front of me from some statements I did many, many years ago when I got different quotes and statements, and we asked people to pick ones that appeal to them. And out of all the ones I could have picked, I've got a Henry Ford quote saying, "Don't find fault, find a remedy."
Mm-hmm.
And that wasn't, for me, why that appealed to me. It wasn't because it was about people finding fault. I don't necessarily like that approach either, but it was the idea that it wasn't about come to me with a solution, but it was come with that intention where I'm not assuming fault, and let's think together how we can remedy this.
Yeah.
So, and I think that's more than one person on their own. So some people individually find fault and don't find a remedy, but it's not up to one person to do that. It's like, can everyone look to not find fault and work together to find a remedy to a solution?
Yeah.
So that for me is one part that I think is hugely important.
And I think we will recognize I guess, what is commonly known as a toxic culture by how much blame exists in that culture. So is the first response from a leader, who did that? If the question is who did that, you're probably in a blame culture, and therefore not particularly inclusive in its intention. I'm really hoping for this podcast that listeners don't exist in our world, and therefore they're curious to learn about it. How do you define psychological safety? It's a phrase we hear a lot in our world, but if you're not in it, and that world being talent, leadership, learning and development, HR, if you're not in that word, how do you, Jo, define psychological safety?
It's that environment that is built where, in either one-to-one or a team setting, for me, it's where people feel safe to really say what they mean, to admit, to say, I've done something wrong, or I did this and this led to this result. So again, that's not assuming. You don't even have to take on that I did this wrong, because sometimes it's not. It's not somebody's fault. It's just a collection of things that happened as a response, and it's maybe outside of their control. So it's the ability to, though, if you did muck up, to say, I'm sorry I mucked up, or I'm concerned about this, to raise a flag and not be shot down or feel that you can't say in that moment, I want to ask this question, but I don't feel I can. And it's the idea that you can do it without fear of consequences, really, for me. And it is that feeling of safety that I think I know as a parent as well about giving to my daughter. And I will talk about that probably in a minute, about how shows up for me. But I think that's what it means for me, is that having that feeling that I can speak up at this moment and I feel safe enough to know I won't be criticized, judged. There may be some outcomes, of course there would be, but I'm not going to feel like I can't say something or have a different point of view from those in leadership positions, perhaps.
Yeah. And I love the fact that, at the heart of what you've just described there is psychological safety as a feeling that protects you in the same way as the health and safety policy protects you and tells you how, if you are physically unsafe, or you go into a job and your health and safety training is, don't pick up heavy boxes in this way, pick it up that way, because that's going to keep you physically safe. The psychological safety is about creating a feeling where you can then behave and communicate in the way that you've described, which is, yeah, I think it's such an important difference, and a real transition I think our profession has been on, from
Yes.
compliance and health and safety and keeping people physically safe, through to now we almost, well, yeah, we need to spend as much, if not more, on keeping them psychologically, emotionally, mentally safe and brave. That's the other thing, isn't it? That for me has been the next evolution. Is it's not just about having a safe space, it's about being able to be brave once you've achieved the safety. So yeah, again, lots of themes will come off of that, but thanks for giving that some
Um,
time on the definition.
and then the other piece, just going back to your question about what does it mean to be a
Yes.
cultivating leader.
Yeah.
Um, the other one that's kind of come up through years of leadership development and programs and hearing external experts and thinkers and speakers and stuff was that feeling of our leadership, what's been called our leadership shadow, our leadership legacy that we leave behind. But what we really mean by that is how we're thought of or talked about by others. And that's been a huge thing that I hold close to my heart. I'm naturally somebody who wants to be liked and wants to be well thought of. And, if anything, you worry too much about being liked, or, and the work you do being well received. However, that feeling that and again, it's about the feelings, but the feelings you've left people with, how have you left them feeling? What's the impact that you've had on them? And looking back at people you've worked with and colleagues, those more senior to you and those more junior to you, how have you left them feeling? What impact have you had on them? And again, yet another quote, and this is the one that's probably most overused, really sadly too often underapplied, is Maya Angelou's quote around people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel, because it's about that being empathetic and kindness and compassion and understanding of other people. And that one has also been hugely important to me through my career.
So as you know, we've done some work together, and the emotional culture deck is a tool that we have used in leadership development programs together. And, you know, to say that, again, the overuse of that's fundamental to the concept of the emotional culture deck, is about feeling. But what I've observed, and I think we've seen some of this in our work, is that when you start to talk about feelings, there's a few triggers that happen for people. It's either, oh, I don't feel comfortable to talk about my feelings because it's a bit soft and woolly, and, you know, I don't feel safe to talk about my feelings because the person across from me is my boss or my peer, or I've got to go and have a difficult conversation with them, and I don't want to disclose that I'm feeling awkward about that, because my role as a leader is to deliver messages and communicate messages, and those messages are not always positive. So
No,
we have this real debate to have with ourselves, and I put myself in this as well. Are we looking for happy cultures, or are we looking for healthy cultures? Because they are not the same thing. And so
not at all.
the complexities internally, it's not just the you know, I love thinking about the impact we have on others and the legacy we leave and how we make other people feel. But before you worry about what you're leaving, you've got to do the work on self as a leader to figure out, because you've got to balance how you make people feel with the work that you do and the expectations that are on you as a leader. And that is not always synonymous and joined up with making people feel good.
Yeah.
How is
Sometimes
that?
they can be the absolute opposite.
Yeah. How has that shown up in your many, many years of management and leadership development?
I think people, and it has changed a lot, I would say, in the workplace, that you can often be minimized perhaps, and often leadership traits weren't seen as caring about how you left others feeling and the impact you had on others. It was performance related. People used to talk about metrics and bonuses and performance, and to some degree a lot of companies still work on that by not emphasizing people enough, or talent, and exit interviews and things like that, where they're done, but perhaps all that exit interview data may not be used and put in talent survey data, which gives us a bit more about how people are feeling about a company. Or is it Glassdoor, with the website that looks at people's ratings and feelings of a company. And it's quite interesting that sometimes that data isn't used. So it's done for show, perhaps, in a lot of places. And are metrics really made about if people in their team are making complaints, and even if they're not making formal complaints, how long are people staying? Are they leaving? Are they moving to another team? Are they moving to another business? And why that is the case. So often I still feel there's so much work to be done around how you're leaving people feeling. You're caring too much about how people are feeling. And if you are a particularly feeling person, you need to switch that off to be successful. You need to care less about what people think of you in order to progress. If you need to be more senior, you need to let things go, and that's one of them. You're not here to be liked. You're here to be efficient, and systems and processes and efficiencies. So still not perfect, it's definitely better, and the focus is changed a lot, but you can still sense that in the business world, I would say.
Yeah, for sure. Well, this whole topic of inclusion and inclusive leadership and its contribution to workplace culture is something that you have been professionally involved in for a very long time. So I learned quite recently about you that one of my favourite pieces of research that was conducted, I think it was back in 2015. You will correct me if I've got my dates wrong. I would love to hear more, from your closeness to that research from your time at Deloitte. Tell us about the 6 C's of inclusive leadership, which was the output from that piece of research done. Tell us what it was like being part of that project. What was the project about? And the original intention behind the 6 C's as a way of defining what it means to be an inclusive leader.
Count myself really lucky. It was when I was in one of my global roles at Deloitte on the global learning side that I got involved with Juliet Ork's research and her team, and the team in Deloitte Australia, who were the originators of the 6 C's, the 6 signature traits of inclusive leadership. And so I had the pleasure of attending one of the first labs that were done around that. So we had an inclusive leadership activation lab. I attended that, and then it wasn't long before COVID hit. So the research had been done. Juliet had worked with her team to develop this program, which was being rolled out, and the concept of inclusive leadership and how important the 6 signature traits was across Deloitte at the time for our own people, before it became kind of client focused. And all the while the research was out there, but it was really beginning to be embedded across Deloitte. We were shortly hit by COVID, and that meant that the in-person program could no longer be delivered. So myself and a couple of others were looking at how we could deliver the concepts and keep up this pace to raise awareness, upskill people and our people through, so they all had a touch, a light touch or a deeper touch, depending on what kind of level you were, around inclusive leadership, because we wanted to get the message there about, because the impact was so huge, as we knew, on business results and organisational results and team results. So I was hugely excited to be part of that team, who then looked at how we could deliver this content in different ways and get it out to the masses as well during and beyond with COVID. So part of the team who developed the virtual program that became the ongoing lab. I also helped trained facilitators who would deliver this program out across the regions and different offices. So it was about how we could upskill people to deliver this content, this great content, and the research, and get that across to people, but also had the absolute pleasure of helping turn the concepts into e-learning.
So I share your passion for the 6 C's and the traits of inclusive leadership. At New Wave Learning, my leadership development business, we used it to inform our own inclusive leadership program. So it's like you, it's very close to my heart. I just want to take a step back, and you've revealed a few of the C's, but there's probably some curious listeners going, what are the C's, Jo? Tell us what the C's
are. Tell me.
We had courage, you said commitment, and you said cultural intelligence. The other 3 are?
So we always start with commitment. So about commitment to inclusion and being an inclusive leader. Courage is the next one that follows, because we need to have the courage and the humility to be able to support people and to call out when there isn't inclusion or we're not being an inclusive leader. Then cognizance of bias, so understanding that we all have unconscious bias. It's a natural thing, and we can't function without unconscious bias, but that because of it, we will all be naturally biased towards our thinking and our decision making will be biased. So how can we be aware of what our biases may be, and how can we mitigate for them? More importantly, curiosity, which is my personal favorite. This is, because we do have so many different people with different ideas. If nothing more than the current climate we're in shows just how different our views can be, but without curiosity of understanding, not necessarily agreeing, definitely not necessarily agreeing with, but an understanding of different views, then we really can't say we're being inclusive or inclusive leader. Definitely. cultural intelligence, which I think historically has been core of inclusion, what we thought of inclusion. That's how it all started, recognizing that different cultures have different approaches and different ways of working, but how can we increase our intelligence and knowledge about that? And collaboration, which is, we always said, it's the pinnacle, it ties everything together, and it's often the one that's missed off, because all of them are well and good on their own, but if we're not collaborating, you're just a group of individuals if you're not collaborating and working together. So those are the 6 C's.
Yeah, I loved hearing that from your perspective. The first reason I loved hearing it is because I too would always start with commitment, but I didn't know that that was the kind of legacy. So there's a little bit of personal affirmation that I'm feeling at the moment.
Yeah.
I start with commitment as well. So Simon Sinek, start with why, no more. It's start with commitment.
Start with commitment. Yeah, you've got to put your line in the sand. This is what we're committed to and why.
Absolutely.
That's about an understanding. So for me, it's a journey, and then bring it together with collaboration at the end.
Yeah, I love that. So this I would start by saying to people, you have to make a personal commitment to this, not just now because I'm training you to become an inclusive leader.
Yeah.
You have to make a commitment every single day that you wake up for the rest of your life as a leader. You have to make a commitment because this is a practice. It is not a skill.
Yeah.
It's not a skill you will master. It is a practice that you need to commit to every single day. And the reason I then went on to explain my personal favorite is cognizance of bias. I had a slide and I loved it every time I put it up. And it just said, we are all biased, full stop. I didn't talk about it being unconscious, subconscious. I just didn't talk about it. We are all biased, and just let it sit there. And it makes people feel uncomfortable. And that's exactly reinforces the point around commitment. You are going to find times, probably every day, where you will say, oh, I just assumed.
All the time.
If you've just assumed, that's your bias. So check it out. Get curious with it. Figure out what's going on. And I think just that demonstration of how the two of us, you've kind of given me the research insight, which has helped me understand that story from commitment to curiosity to cognizance of bias. But through this conversation and me sharing but actually the way I've applied it is commitment, cognizance of bias, and then curiosity is the flexibility to be able to still tell your own leadership story.
Yes.
But still get to the same outcome. You'll still get to the same outcome, but you just take a slightly different journey. And I think that for me was the beauty of, obviously the results from the research was fantastic, but the beauty of applying and taking people on that journey. And I know it's an overused phrase, but inclusive leadership 100% is a journey. Taking them through that journey of discovery about themselves as much as the impact they were going to have on the people that were following them was one of my greatest career highlights. And I know that echoes for you in your time at Deloitte with this program.
It does. And I think cognizance of bias one is also hugely important where we are now, because there has been such a call out for you're doing diversity training or, and labeling everything together. Diversity and inclusion are very different and are needed together, but they are essentially very, very different and not the same thing. And when people were people now looking at, have you done any bias training, and have you done anything like that, and not necessarily looking at it in a positive way. And I think sometimes it's been overused. Unfortunately, people have gone, right, we're doing bias training on this, that, and the other, and if it's not done correctly, it can have the opposite effect of making people feel like they are bad and they are doing wrong things and they can't do anything right. And that's why That one is so important to get right and to put the emphasis on. There's awareness. We need to build enough awareness that people understand that they naturally occurring because our brain requires it, because of the amount of information we get. We cannot absorb. We use our unconscious bias to filter out the information that's bombarding us every day. So without it, our brains would literally explode with all the data if we didn't pay attention and focus on bits that we were biased towards, the bits that we want to see and want to take in. But people feeling that I wouldn't do that. That's what you'd say. Well, I don't do that. So people go, why am I learning about this? Because I don't do that. I wouldn't do this. This isn't me. Why would anyone do that? Or that was never my intention. When people bring in the intention doesn't matter because it's naturally occurring in everyone's brains.
Yeah.
You can't build intentions. It's a slow thinking process, intention. Unconscious bias is a quick thing that happens when you don't know it's happening because we need it. People understanding that it's been overdone and perhaps done in the wrong way, and it can have a negative. People get defensive. People can get defensive when you're talking about biases.
Absolutely.
They're like, again, and disassociate themselves from that. And they'll be like, well, I don't do that, so I'm not going to listen anymore. And that's why that one is really important to get right.
Yeah. Well, I mean, bias has a bad rep.
It does. It
Bias has
does.
a bad rep, and I really feel kind of I've dropped my game on kind of bigging up bias, if I'm honest, because just by nature of like the work I'm doing now, sort of taking me away from that a little bit. But I really want to change that for people. That, as you've said, bias is a natural function, but it can have a positive impact, which is, again, but that positive impact for one person may be perceived as a negative impact on another person. It's very complex. It's incredibly complex. But yeah, we could do a whole episode about bias. I mean, that's the point. But what I wanted to pick up on was possibly sort of moving us forward to kind of, it's 10 years on since the research, right? And for us to explore kind of what's changed as a result of it, but maybe what hasn't shifted as much as potentially was hoped.
Yeah.
Because the research was so compelling. It's almost like, why does not everybody know about the 6 C's and practicing the 6 C's and, implementing behavior frameworks around the 6 C's? Because we know the research, we know it works, we know it makes a difference. So yeah, kind of curious to see, a decade on, what's changed from your perspective from the goodness of it, but maybe what hasn't shifted as much.
Yeah, I think that historically, so if we look, and I nudged on this a bit earlier, historically, it was very much focused on diversity and metrics. And the conversations were always about, we've got diversity, we've got these many hires, we're hiring for this, we're hiring for that. We're promoting that, we're setting up mentoring programs. And while that was good, again, was focused on diversity. And one of the things learned from the 6 C's is that, diversity without inclusion is meaningless. You can have any organization, even negative groups, which are diverse in their population, but it doesn't mean there's inclusion at all. And what I loved was this was changing the conversation, that while diversity and metrics are important to send a message about and to look at change over time, hugely important, it's not the same as inclusion. So you can have a group of people together and then find out that, they aren't feeling trusted or empowered. They're not feeling inspired or valued, or they belong, but they may be a part of a massive diverse team. So again, one without the others meaningless. So it's great to take the conversation away from just diversity and expand it out into, okay, that's all well and good, but it doesn't matter if we've got all the same people together. I mean, they're more likely to get on and collaborate, but let's focus on the what we can do to make them feel included, regardless of levels of diversity. So that's been great to see that change. At Deloitte, we did have a picture that showed the difference between diversity and inclusion, which I loved using as part of the development, which was ingredients on one side of the picture, which were like chocolate chips, oats, sugar, blah, 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 blah. And that was to represent diversity. And on the other side was a cookie, which was basically you've got all those ingredients together and you've made this cookie. So all the ingredients on their own separated was diversity. And then on the other side, but all those ingredients together make the cookie. So that's the difference to me. So you don't want to eat the separate ingredients. You don't want to, so many spoonfuls of sugar and oats, and that together doesn't make anything. It's just a group of ingredients. But on the other side, you've got the final product and it works lovely together and we like it. Thank you very much. So that change for me is great. And then historically, obviously, it was about cultural intelligence. There was a lot of, this culture does this and this culture does that. And I think there was quite a lot of that and appreciation as we've got more virtual and international, and companies got more international and global or even regional, that we work different, and an appreciation of that. And I think that was great, all as starters. Then the bias piece. And I think so that has opened up the conversation to how we do it. And I think people are having those conversations. We got to a point where people were actively having discussions about an awareness building about potential for bias, or understanding that it takes more than just having a diverse workforce to make things successful. And I think there's a lot around building of curiosity as being a key skill that people need, and coming with a kind of, I like to call it a coaching mindset, where you're asking questions and coming with curiosity to conversations. I think that has changed, and we've looked at processes and systems have changed in terms of hiring or writing job descriptions out for the market. I saw some wonderful things across recruitment teams in some of our larger offices at Deloitte, and that they were implementing to change the systems and the processes, because they found out that words you could put in job descriptions were either more favorable to men or women, and how they could change the job description just slightly and you would change the type of people that apply for the roles. And I was like, this is amazing stuff. And, great that we can use technology as well to do that. So we began to see more curiosity, and we began to see, a change in how we were measuring diversity. The diversity lens, as a consequence, got wider. So whereas it might have been around gender or race particularly, now the language has changed onto neurodiversity and appreciating that. And I think that has given the way. All this talk of inclusive leadership has slowly opened the route for more things to be talking about how people differ and bringing people together with different perspectives.
That resonates. That particular point resonates so deeply, because for me, that was almost the why we should do inclusive management and leadership training rather than train people to understand the 86 types of bias in an unconscious bias training course. I was, I kind of like, what does it matter? Because the lens of diversity is rapidly growing. So all of the ways in which somebody can tick your diversity stat boxes, there's more and more and more, and it's only going to grow. So if we keep chasing the stat or the data, we're never going to get on top of this. We are actually, in my opinion, what's happened over the decade is that we're actually at this point where diversity without inclusion becomes division. Because the
Yes.
diversity
Yeah.
groups, if you look at the number of organizations, and I know within your own experience, you look at the number of organizations that have employee resource groups, and they're all for a group of people who feel like they are a minority or feel that they are othered in some way to come together to create a safe space because they don't feel it, they don't necessarily feel it anywhere else. So you have these employee resource groups that exist with a good intention, but actually we have to, I think, challenge ourselves really deeply here to say, do the resource groups need to exist because we're doing diversity but we're not doing inclusion? And therefore, and we can look at this kind of outside in the wider global kind of culture and community work that, if you just switch on the radio right now, you hear about, we've got diversity, we've acknowledged diversity. Diversity is growing, extending, but divisions never felt so close to me.
Both. Yeah.
I mean,
So
how
very,
does
very
that
close.
reflection resonate with you, Joe?
It does, especially outside the work landscape. And I think the focus on like employee resource groupings and things like that, I think sometimes I enjoy the elements which are about awareness raising. And I think that keeps on top of our cultural intelligence piece.
Yes.
I am grateful that I've had the experiences in global roles and global companies that I've had that have naturally allowed me to get an understanding of people's cultures from across the world. And during COVID, I was very appreciative of understanding how my colleagues in different parts of the world were dealing with COVID, dealing with their own lockdown places, how they were dealing with it, how their families were coming together, how their communities were coming together. The range was huge, and how their government systems were setting up to protect them or not, as a wide range of views showed. I don't think many people get access to that. And what I've found for the division is that is a lack of opportunity of awareness of what these cultures look like in practice, what it actually means for people day to day, and an understanding of what the challenges are, and that some things are happening similar in other countries and some things are completely different. And I think a lot of people don't have that opportunity to work in global roles or global companies, and they don't have that ability to be awareness every day, to hear the mundane things and appreciation, because it sure opened my eyes when there was a lot of the government's doing this and this here in the UK, and I was like, I hear the same from my colleagues no matter where they are in the world. It showed to me, no one is satisfied or happy with whatever route their government or their local community took to that. And I think sometimes we become more closed. And so I think those employee groups are great if they allow us to be educated and open our minds to understand somebody's experience from a different view. But yes, I think the more boxes that get ticked, as we see, the more it becomes, I'm now smaller. People feel more unsafe because they're going, oh, now I feel a minority in this. And fear, as we know, can bring about lots of different things.
Yes. Well, I mean, absolutely. And so when we looked at something like cultural intelligence, immediately the response was, well, how do you expect me to become more culturally intelligent because I can't travel anymore? And by the end of the program, it was really, I mean, it was brilliant to see how people's minds had opened to this idea of how if we are creative, we can get the opportunity to take different perspectives. So you were referring to this, and like you, I've, been blessed to work in global roles, which has given me exposure over and above what typically people get. But there was some real creativity and some genuine curiosity being shown, and commitments being made at the end of the program for people to go, I'm a white middle-aged man and I'm going to go and join the women's resource group because I now have an understanding that my lived experience, as these boxes that I tick on my diversity stats, have meant that I've got a very skewed way in which I experience the world, and there are other people. And when we started to see how, again, the courage it took for people to say, it's going to make me feel uncomfortable, but I'm going to go and sit in that group and do the work myself, rather than, I think what has happened to employee resource groups is that they become the educators. So
yes, and
it's Pride Month.
then
It's Pride Month, so let's call in the appropriate resource, or it's Black History Month, or whatever the diversity lens is that we are acknowledging in that day or that month. Let's bring them in, and they can tell us. And I think for me, it's a real frustration. I feel frustrated, but I sense that there is a tension in, do the work yourself. I shouldn't be expected to tell you. You should do the work yourself. And again, the essence of the 6 C's, bring all of that together to set people up with the skills and understanding as to why people hold that position, and why, as inclusive leaders, we should be committed to that position being held and being okay with that, not seeing it as defiance or rebellion, but actually seeing it as a point of, I need to be challenged in this way.
And again, I think it's always linked to curiosity. That's what I'm interested as to why you've asked that or why you've said that. Can you tell me more? In a conversation with somebody that may, for different reasons, and it may be different cultural aspects, people may put it down to their country culture or their religion or their gender, but you don't know, because most people are a mix. There's lots of different elements within them. I'm not just a woman in business. I'm not just a parent in business. So there's all those different levels and shades that lead up to my own unique kind of way I approach things, led by culture and background and everything. I think that curiosity allows us to have those conversations as to what might be influencing that. And it may be a cultural thing, but again, if we don't ask, we don't understand in those bits. But rather than, you need to tell me, dear colleague that we're working with from a different country, why you want to do it like this. That's not how it's done. That's not how I've done it. So I think that coming with a genuine curiosity is helpful, and an understanding that perhaps, again, shifting that mindset. I've always thought it's important for coaching that you come to conversations with the idea that you don't know more than the other person. You don't automatically, because often we come to conversations going, well, I'm the expert on this, or I'm more senior, so therefore you must be asking for my opinion. But if you go into a conversation with the view or the mindset of, that person knows more than me, it changes the questions that you ask. And so that can be quite interesting to authentically come with curiosity rather than just ticking the box.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think there's so much more that could be done. And I know that you had asked about what hasn't shifted as much as I'd hoped. And there was a couple of things I thought were just hugely important. One we talked about, which is the unconscious bias being misunderstood or framed incorrectly, which we've talked about. I think that given the recent political and world landscape, again, I've mentioned already that the concepts of diversity and inclusion have become intertwined, and then with people going, right, I don't want to be involved with diversity or any diversity programs, but that's not what we're not measuring metrics. We can for inclusive leadership, but that's not what it's about, and not confusing those concepts. So it's I also want them separated as well, so that people understand inclusion on its own and how it's different from diversity, important for both to be there. So that hasn't shifted, or it's shifted a little backwards, as well as I think people began to get very vocal in the elements of the courage and commitment, those two C's. And we had a lot of people putting their flag up and saying, I stand by this, or I think this is important and this is how I'm going to do it. And I think some people have now, in the past year or so, they're afraid to speak up. So I see that as quietening down, and that to me is a real shame.
Yeah.
Really, really a big shame. And
I
then ones that I think sorry, Sarah.
Yeah, well, no, I think it's bigger than shame. I think it's a concern, and
Yeah,
it's
yeah, I would
risk,
agree.
and it's
Yeah,
a risk if we don't address it. So I think if I was rewriting or evolving the six C's today, given the landscape is very different from when the research was first carried out, right? So we now have this thing called fully remote workplaces. We have hybrid workplaces. We have AI. I mean, I know it was around when the research was done, but we weren't talking about it. We take all of those things, and I think almost there is an argument in my mind that says courage almost has to become before courage has to come before commitment now. Like when you started
yes,
telling
yeah.
us it was
I
kind of
think
commitment first, I think courage has to come before commitment, because so much of today's tension, the willingness to, or the feelings of uncertainty, the feelings of I'm too scared to say what I really think, those things are all, they're all deep rooted in fear. And the counter to that is courage, right? We are behaving from a place of fear, which means that those that control the fear that's being felt are taking us back to a command and control compliance culture.
compliance, definitely compliance.
Whereas, the courage is what leads us to the inclusion and collaboration. But while power sits with the people that control the fear,
Yeah,
and I genuinely think that the courage almost needs to go above.
totally agree with that. Definitely, given the new landscape and where
Yeah,
we're working on, that
yeah,
it's a bit of a backward step, but to show that, and for the real benefits of inclusive leadership to be shown, rather than we've been getting lots of this is what happens when you get to diversity, and it's just like, no, this is what happens when you get to inclusion, and focus on that positive, reframe courage and the importance of it. It's not, and not being shouted down, and what would I sharpen, or
mm,
evolve. um the accountability needs to be brought out as well. I mean, it doesn't fit into a neat C. So, and it was always there as part of commitment, but, where it comes with courage and commitment, that where leaders really could hold people accountable, and where organizations could hold people accountable, where they're not fostering this inclusive feel, or this environment, and then they're being held responsible to upkeep it, because without that, ultimately things will, go down. Again, if you're just doing it for ticking off diversity metrics, that still doesn't say that people are held accountable to it. And the other aspects I thought of were psychological safety should be brought. It was part of that, but it's become an even more important of courage. Again, I think if it was to go within one, it would be within there. So to provide people with the courage, the psychological safety to speak up, be included, and the accountability part, and I suppose, is the element of turning it into every day. It's not I've done a program and it's done. One of the things we always tried to do was nudges or nuggets that needed to be brought into the everyday. You mentioned it as well earlier, Sarah, that it's an everyday habit,
It's
really.
a habit,
If
absolutely.
we've got the systems there, if not, how are we using technology? And I don't mean in necessarily an AI way, because that's got its own issues, but how can we use technology to give ourselves nudges or points at the moments where they're really important for leaders? And I think leaders need to understand what points in their jobs at each level are the key inclusion points. Which points are you talking about? Promotions? Are you hiring? Are you taking on new project team members? Have you faced a difficult situation? Somebody in the team's made a mistake. These are all hugely important everyday moments, or that you'll have throughout your year, where it's important for you to be inclusive, and having something to remind you to do that in the moment, just a few little things as to why and what you can do, is really going to make the difference. In the initial research, a big part of it was around collective intelligence. It's not one of the 6 C's. I actually did a kind of job aid that teams could look at their own levels of collective intelligence, CQ as it's called, and you could look at, and it was originally part of the research, and I think it's been often forgotten about. And that's the whole idea that, again, with the collection of individuals, you want to create a team that is smarter than each of you individually. And if we have a diversity of thinking, again, hugely important, people look at neurodiversity, but the diversity of approaches and diversity of thinking, that is going to make a team really powerful, regardless of diversity or any of it. If you look at the collective intelligence in a team, I think that was an element that didn't fit neatly. It was fitted to the side, and I thought that could be really brought out more.
Yeah, and there's something about that, just the intention to do that challenges this idea of we've become more divided and people are becoming more divisive in our current. So I've made a note to look up that and do a bit more learning about that myself. And I think that's how I'd like to bring this particular conversation or today's podcast to a close, Joe, because as I suspected, this conversation with you has really held a mirror up to me as a leader and as someone who calls myself an aspiring inclusive leader with intention. So I aspire to be an inclusive leader. I don't say I am, because it's not
Mm.
me that determines whether I am or not. It's the impact that I have and how I make people feel. They will determine whether I am an inclusive leader or not. So I'm very intentional about aspiring to be an inclusive leader. If this conversation has caused people to stop and reflect on their commitment to being an inclusive leader, as it has for me today, what, with all of your breadth and depth of experience around this topic, what practical suggestions, tips, ideas can you give us to go and do as a result of that, that moment of, I don't think I'm maybe doing as much as I could or as well as I could? What practical things can people like me go and do to kind of reaffirm or recommit to being an inclusive leader?
I think there is I'm trying to think of which ones were most important to me. I think the first thing some of the things I would do were to think of those moments in whatever role you're in, whatever job you do, those moments when you're considering your approach, your response, and you're dealing with people. So there's potentially moments of power that you may have, and decision making that tend to be the biggest points, where especially decision making, when you have ultimately power over people or approaches or routes you'll take, to consider first what they are, what they might look like. For people in my role, it is that kind of recruitment, start of a project, a new team member, appraisal times, and objective setting times, even when you're asking for feedback on a project. How do you respond? How do you react? Who do you listen to more than somebody else? And if you're not in the world of facilitating, where you have to be a bit more used to taking on listening out for all views and gathering all views, or you're not a practice coach who stops and step backs, I would say have a moment to reflect on what those moments are for you on your position of power or decision making, and think around how you can, in the moments where you're practicing these, can you take a step back and ask, do I think I would answer this question differently if it was about another person, for example? Sometimes we did a nudge about just, I am an inclusive leader who wants to give everyone the same opportunities. Am I practicing equity? Am I the difference? And go and take a look at one of the comic strip or, memes there are about the difference between equality and equity. I thought that was always hugely important for me to understand in the world of journey of neurodiversity that I've learnt about since learning my daughter's neurodiverse, and that's a massive long journey. And understanding the difference between equality and equity was hugely important as to what I want. So how can I give people the same chance of being successful? What can I do or change in these moments so I give everyone an equal chance of being successful? And if I don't want to, ask those reflective questions. Why has that triggered me? Why do I feel annoyed by this? Why have I made this assumption? Then it's a good thing to do. Also, take a look at some of the common unconscious biases and have a think about where you might notice them. And there is an easy to do online unconscious bias test, and for the life of me I've forgotten what it's called now, but I will find it, where there's some of the top ones that you can do, and there's different ones for different locations. So US has a different one than the UK, and it can look at like it can test very high level quick test for gender, race, and some of those biases that you may not be aware of, and just be curious. Say, oh, what's come up for me?
Brilliant. So my commitment to you is that I am absolutely going to take notice of where I hold power or when I am making decisions, and re-challenge myself on the assumptions I might be making where those moments of power and decision making exists. There's my commitment based on what I've noticed in myself while we've been talking. Jo, it has been a pleasure, but before I let you go, very quickly, I'm asking every guest that comes on the podcast. I'm a big believer in, lifting other people up. Is there a podcast that you've listened to or are listening to at the moment that you would recommend to our listeners? And it doesn't have to be about inclusive leadership, but if you have one, that would be very cool.
I've got two firm favourites. Can I be sneaky and ask for two, Sarah? Two that I listen to all the time in my car journeys. One, even my daughter listens with me. So one is No Such Thing as a Fish podcast, which are the researchers from QI, the TV show. They look at their interesting facts over the week, their top 4 facts from the week, and it's funny, hilarious. You'll never know what silly, interesting facts that come out of it. I love what I learn, no matter how random, and it's humorous. It's Brilliant. Such an easy listen to. I just wish they did more than one a week.
I'm sure they'll love to hear that.
Yeah, I know. So that's always a firm favourite in car journeys. And the other one is somebody who actually I met, and I'm so privileged, I feel, to know her. An amazing lady called Denisha Melina Durbin. She calls herself an obnoxious mother of 10. She is a mother of 10. I would not use the word obnoxious. I think many words to describe her, but obnoxious is not my word. Parents Who Think podcast.
Okay.
And it's really aimed at taking on, controversial or non-controversial kind of topics and speakers, some great speakers she's had over the years, for helping parents perhaps to think about. It's mainly aimed at people to be more deeper thinking parents, maybe curious and more aware. So I love hearing those topics. There's no topic she will stray away from, and no speaker she will not have on the show.
You have got me curious. I will be going to check both of those out. They actually sound right up my street. So thank you for those recommendations. And thank you again on behalf of myself
Pleasure.
and my listeners for coming and spending some time with us today. Really appreciate it. Thank you, Jo.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thanks so much for listening to the Culturevating Leader podcast. If today's episode has sparked something in you, please share it, tag me, or leave a review. It really helps us to get to more leaders and help them discover the power of emotional culture. To learn more about how we help organisations to build a culture that aligns with their purpose, head to culturevator.co.uk or connect with me on LinkedIn. And remember, if you want your clients to feel X, then your people need to feel your Y. So, what inspired you today to be a cultivating leader? Until the next episode, let's keep culture at the heart of how we lead.